Let's continue with epidemiology. In this session, we'll discuss tools of measurements. What is rate? What is ratio? What is proportion? Then we will calculate secondary attack rate. Then we will classify various studies. Then we will give brief overview of these studies. In the end, we will summarize the session. So let's start with tools of measurement. There are three tools of measurement: rate, ratio, and proportion. What is rate? What is ratio and what is proportion? Rate is number of times an event is occurring. What is ratio? Difference between two proportions, difference between two quantities. What is proportion? Portion of whole. So let's start with rate. We can say that rate is defined as number of times an event is occurring. Like we have measured incidence. Incidence is rate. Or we have measured death rate, like infant mortality rate. All of these are rates. They show the frequency. And what is ratio? Ratio is the difference between two quantities, like male female ratio. Oh, so what is ratio? Ratio is the difference between two quantities. Like we can say that male female ratio. Let's suppose there are 52% males and 42% females. Can say that male female ratio is 52:48. What is proportion? Portion of whole, like proportional mortality rate. Proportional mortality rate indicates what is proportion of a certain disease. Like we say that proportional mortality rate of measles. How many people are dying from measles? And we divide this with total number of deaths. This is proportional mortality rate. Or we can say that proportional mortality due to coronavirus. We divide the mortality due to coronavirus with total mortality or with total deaths. This will indicate the burden of coronavirus. This will indicate the proportion of coronavirus. Proportional mortality rate is used to differentiate between the number of deaths due to a specific cause. Like we say that cause of death is coronavirus and there are total number of deaths. What is actual burden of coronavirus? What is actual mortality of coronavirus? Or we compare this mortality with the total number of deaths. Now we will discuss secondary attack rate. What is secondary attack rate? It is the probability. It is the probability of infection that occurs in susceptible people within a specific group like household or close contacts. This is used in communicable diseases. And we have used the term susceptible people. What is meant by this? Those who are at high risk, like people who are not vaccinated, who are not immunized, they are at high risk. People who are exposed. Specific group shows those who are exposed. Like we say that there are total 20 people living in a house. One of them gets coronavirus, or one of them is infected with coronavirus, and six were vaccinated. These six are who are vaccinated, they are not at risk, they are not susceptible. Always minus those who are vaccinated, they are not at risk. Don't do the mistake. They take this, they add this in the total population. No, we have to take those who are susceptible. So, other one who is diseased or who is already suffering from coronavirus, it's also subtracted. So, total susceptible people will be 13. We minus 7 because one is suffering from coronavirus and 6 are vaccinated. Secondary attack rate is calculated among them. Like we solve one miracle that a village has total 200 under 5 children. So the coverage of measles vaccination is 65%. Means 65% children are vaccinated against measles. Following the occurrence of measles case in a child after visit outside. A child went outside, gets measles, comes back and has infected 50 more children. How will we calculate secondary attack rate? First, what was total population? It is 200. And vaccine coverage 65%. So we have to exclude them. How will we calculate them? 65 multiplied by total population 65%. So when we remove percentage, we'll divide 65 with 100. Our answer will be 130. 130 children are immunized. So total population is 200. We will subtract 130 because they are not at risk. There are 70 children. But as we know that primary case who is infected is also not susceptible. So 70 children and we will subtract one primary case. So total susceptible will be 69. 69 children are vulnerable to develop the measles in a certain village. But 50 children develop measles. What will be formula of secondary attack rate? Number of new cases divided by susceptible ones. Multiply by 100. There are 50 new cases. 50 children developed measles from primary case and total susceptible were 69 cars. Out of 200, 130 were vaccinated. One was primary case. So our answer will be 72%. Secondary attack rate of measles in this village is 72%, which is quite higher. A disease spreads from the chains, and in this scenario, a disease has propagation. Disease will spread from person to person. This is propagated epidemic of measles. Measles spreads rapidly. This indicates the rate of spread of measles is rapid. And we said that under 5 children. Why we said this? Cause measles is predominant in children under 5 years of age. It's more severe in children under 5 years of age. So let's solve another scenario. Total population of a house is 6. 6 people are living in a house. We have mother who is vaccinated. One child develops chickenpox and he spreads the disease to more children. So how we will calculate this? We have to subtract the primary case and mother. So total population was 6 and we subtract 2 from them. They are not susceptible. So people who are susceptible are 4 and new cases is 2. 2 children develop chickenpox from primary case and 4 of them were vulnerable or susceptible. Now we will discuss various analytical studies. These are cross-sectional, these are ecological, case control, and cohort study. We will briefly discuss them in this session. Then explanation of all the study will be in other sessions like cross-sectional study. What is cross-sectional analytical studies? When two groups are compared, remember, we can compare two groups and we move from cause to effect or from effect to cause in these studies. We move from exposure to outcome or from outcome to exposure in analytical studies. We analyze the results. We compare two groups in these studies, like in cross-sectional analytical study. Two groups are compared, like we can say that Take total population, draw sample. We see diseased one and non-diseased ones. We will see among disease those who are exposed and non-exposed, certain people. So let's discuss cross-sectional analytical study. We take a cross-section of a population, like there is total population, take a sample, then we observe those who are diseased and non-diseased. We see those who are diseased, they may be exposed or they may be non-exposed. Those who are non-diseased, they may be exposed or may be non-exposed. This means all people who are diseased, they are not exposed to a risk factor under study. Those who are non-diseased, it is not necessary that all of them are non-exposed. People who are exposed are non-diseased. Can be non-diseased. People who are non-exposed to a certain risk factor can be diseased. This is cross-sectional analytical study. So, what is ecological study? Is environmental study, study of environment. We move from risk factor to outcome, or we move from outcome to risk factor. We can move in both directions in ecological studies. It shows disease is occurring in a certain environment. What is burden or disease due to a certain environment? Like environment, we say that overcrowding is an environment. It causes communicable diseases. Burden of communicable disease increase in overcrowding. And then we'll discuss what is case control study. Case control study. This is retrospective study. Case control study is a type of analytical study which is retrospective. We move from present to past, or we can say that we move from outcome to exposure. In a case control study, we compare disease with non-disease. Cases are those who are having the disease, and controls are those who are not having the disease under study. We move in a retrospective way from present to past. What we will measure in case control study? Always remember odds ratio. We measure odds ratio in case control study. What is cohort study? Cohort study is a prospective study. Cohort study is a type of analytical study which is prospective. This means we move from exposure to outcome. Those who are included in cohort study, they are not diseased, they are exposed, and we will see how many of them establish disease. Like we say that we take people who are exposed, we observe them over a certain time period, we observed exposed group, and in the end we see how many of them develop disease and how many did not develop disease or don't develop disease. So we move forward. What we will measure from cohort study? We will measure incidence. Incidence is measured in a cohort study. So if we differentiate descriptive studies from analytical studies, we can say that in descriptive studies, we take only one group. In analytical studies, we compare two groups. We can measure incidence, prevalence from descriptive studies, and we can measure odds ratio, incidence from analytical studies. Descriptive studies are population based. We study whole population, and analytical studies are person based, a group of people. So these are the differences between descriptive studies and analytical studies. If we take one group, then this is descriptive study. If we make comparison, this is analytical study. We'll do certain analysis between the two groups. And incidence and prevalence is measured in descriptive study. This is a common MCQ. And odds ratio and incidence are measured in analytical studies. Descriptive studies are population based. How to pick the scenario? A scenario will be given in the examination. If you want to measure the burden of disease in a certain population, which study you will carry out, your answer should be descriptive study. And if we compare two groups. If we take diseased and non-diseased, the study will be case control. If we take exposed people, the study will be cohort. Now we will discuss experimental studies. Experimental studies. They may be randomized controlled trial. Randomized controlled trial. Why it is called randomized controlled trial? Because we randomly divide a population or a sample into two groups to minimize the bias. And other one is non-randomized controlled trial. Let's discuss them. RCT are randomized controlled trials. They are clinical trials, they are preventive trials, they are experimental studies in which we take a reference population, we take a sample from this reference population by using a certain sampling technique. We use purposive sampling because there is predetermined idea. So there is a MCQ. Why we take purposive sampling in randomized controlled trial? Because there is an idea behind the study. This is non-probability sampling. We have already decided the idea, like we want to study the effect of atropine. We want to study the effect of atenolol. So idea is already decided. So this is purposive sampling. In randomized controlled trial, steps are: number one, reference population. What is reference population? A population from which a sample is drawn. Then we will take the sample. Then we will do randomization. We'll divide the sample into two groups: study group, placebo group, by randomization. What is meant by randomization? We'll take a random numbers or a table of random numbers and divide them into two. Both of them have equal chance. So we will minimize the bias. Question will be, why randomization is done? To eliminate or to minimize bias. Then we'll do interventions on this, or manipulations. Then we will do follow-up. After doing follow-up, we'll make some assessment. I'll do assessment. Randomized controlled trial is called randomized controlled trial because we select a sample and randomly divide this sample into two, study group and placebo group. Why it is controlled? Independent variable like temperature, dose of drug is in our control. That's why this is called control. Trial means experiment. So three, always remember three words. So there is a common question. Why randomized control trial is called randomized control trial? Randomized control trial. Because of three things. Number one, we do randomization. We randomly divide the sample into two groups. controlled, independent variable. Independent variable is in our control, like temperature, like dose of drug. These are in our control. And trial, experiment. What are various examples of randomized controlled trial? Clinical trial, preventive trial. In clinical trial, we do experiment on certain drugs like atenolol. Trial of atenolol or therapeutic trial is clinical trial. What is preventive trial? Trial of vaccines like vaccine of coronavirus, vaccine of malaria. This is preventive trial. A trial which is done for therapeutic purposes is clinical trial. A trial which is done for preventive purposes is preventive trial. So now we'll discuss non-randomized controlled trial. What is non-randomized controlled trial? Randomization is not required in non-randomized controlled trial. We take only one group, do the intervention, and make the assessment. So this is done on one group. Like uncontrolled trial. What is uncontrolled trial? We take one group, do the intervention. We can give example of cervical cancer. We already know that. Pap smear is diagnostic test of cervical cancer. And cervical cancer is common in women of low socioeconomic status. So there is no need to take two groups, or there is no need of comparison group in this study. We just take a group of female who belong to low socioeconomic status. We do pap smear in them. Then we measure the burden of cervical cancer in them. This is uncontrolled trial. Other examples may be before and after comparison trial. What is meant by before and after? Before and after of certain intervention. Before and after of certain legislation. Let's suppose we want to see the burden of accidents before and after the intervention of seat belts. We'll see what was the burden of accidents before seat belts. We applied a legislation of seat belt. Now we'll see what is burden of accidents after seat belts. If it is reduced, we can say that our intervention is successful. You can give example of helmets. Before helmets and after the application of helmets in motorcycle cyclists, the incidence or prevalence of death may decrease. Severity of injury may decrease after this intervention. We study this before and after in the same group. We see what was happening before the application of intervention or legislation. What is happening after the application? Now, we will summarize this lecture. We discussed what are tools of measurements. These were rate, ratio, and proportion. What is rate? Number of times an event is occurring. Ratio? Ratio is the differentiation or proportion between two variables or quantities. And what is proportion? Number of times, or we can say that proportion is part of whole. Then we discussed secondary attack rate. We learned how to measure secondary attack rate. We discussed that we divide new cases with total susceptible cases. We discussed that secondary attack rate is used to measure the spread of communicable disease in a certain population. Like we discussed the secondary attack rate of measles in a population. We discussed that we have to subtract those who are vaccinated and those who are primary cases from total population. Denominator is those who are susceptible. Then we discussed various epidemiological studies. We discussed that there are two main types of studies, observational and non-observational. Observational studies are further subdivided into descriptive studies and analytical studies. And experimental studies are subdivided into randomized controlled trial and non-randomized controlled trial. Then descriptive studies are subdivided into Longitudinal and cross-sectional studies. Descriptive studies measure the burden of disease. They are population-based studies. In the end, we can formulate the hypothesis. We can measure incidence from longitudinal studies. We can measure prevalence from cross-sectional studies. These don't discuss effect and cause. Only one group is studied in descriptive studies. So what are analytical studies? We discussed that. We do comparison of two groups. We measure effect and cause, either in a prospective way or in a retrospective way. When we move in a retrospective way, this is case control study. Cause disease is already present. We move from outcome to exposure in case control studies. What is prospective study? Cohort study. We move from exposure to outcome in cohort study. This was the basic difference between descriptive studies and analytical studies. Then we discussed experimental studies. Experiments basically give the exact cause. We know the cause after doing experimental studies. We discussed randomized control trial and non-randomized control trial. What is randomized control trial? We can say that when we divide the sample randomly into two groups, this is randomized control trial and independent variable is in our control. What is non-randomized control trial? When we only take one group and do the intervention. This was the basic difference between randomized control trial and non-randomized control trial. We also discussed that preventive trial and clinical trials are example of randomized control trial. Uncontrolled trial and before and after comparison studies are examples of non-randomized controlled trials. So we move from descriptive study to experimental studies. This is basic hierarchy of studies or research studies. First, we will do descriptive study. Then we will move to case control study. Then we will move to cohort study. Then we will move to experimental study. That's all. Thank you very much.